Joy is among the most elusive human states to put into language. In many ways, it is a call from the ineffable. The ineffable is that which is beyond language. In that sense, it is the marker on the thermometer of the human heart that flags the proximity of the doorway back into the larger ecology and the larger ecological paradigm out of which the isolated human ego emerges and descends from. Now, on the resonance continuum, you have very high resonances that are similar to very high sounds. And at a certain point, the sound becomes inaudible. It's above the frequency of human hearing. Now, this high frequency versus low frequency correlates with another metaphor, which is density of pattern and form, density of energy in formation, and less dense. I'm not sure what you would call it, spacious, lighter. And one of the phenomena in the creation of both matter and the observing and measuring devices in the five senses that we possess to experience and in many ways create matter, because does a tree make a sound if no one hears it? Is there matter if no one has the observing and measuring devices to observe it? In deep particle physics, we see certain phenomena where the measuring device determines what is occurring. There's this split photon experiment where if you look through, if you have only one photon, if that's the smallest particle of light that you're dealing with, and you shoot it, it has to go through one of two holes, if there are only two holes there, in order to reach the other side. Well, some of these experiments show that if you shoot the light and look from one angle, it'll go through one hole, but if you look from another angle, it'll go through the other hole. In other words, it changes in direct response to the observation deck set up to measure it. Another experiment shows that at the nexus of manifestation, where energy is bifurcating into either wave or particle formation, that if at that bifurcation point you measure a wave, it'll show up as a wave. And if you measure a particle, it'll show up as a particle. Probability is possibility squared. In other words, if you take the field of all possibility and you fold it and overlay it on itself, it's suggestive of taking a sheet, a bed sheet, a towel, a square of cloth, a circle of cloth. If you fold the circle, if you fold the sheet, it gets thicker, it gets stronger, it gets more tangible, becomes harder to rip apart. That probability is possibility squared, and that actuality is probability squared. So you take the lightness of the energy field, you fold it on top of itself, and now it's twice as strong. It's like taking a piece of dental floss, and perhaps a piece of dental floss will break at maybe 70, 80 to 200 pounds, somewhere in there the dental floss snaps. But if you fold it on top of itself again and pull again, it's twice as strong. And if you fold it again, it gets twice as strong again. And so it gets more and more dense. And in that sense, more and more real. Actuality is possibility squared to become probability, and probability squared to become actuality. The present actual moment is the densest form of the fractal pattern that becomes reality when it is observed. Well, one of the phenomena is as you keep folding that sheet over and folding the sheet over, or taking a 1 meter piece of dental floss and folding it to become half a meter, it's twice as strong, but it's twice as short. You fold it again, it's twice as strong and twice as short. As reality compresses from possibility to probability to actuality, it gets smaller and smaller. By the time you're in a physical body viewing itself from the fragmented, isolated, distinct mind of the human ego, you can't be two places at once. In the possibility field, you can be everywhere and nowhere at once, simultaneously. In the probability field, it's smaller, but you've got bigger terrain. In the actuality field, if I'm sitting here in this moment, saying these words, I cannot be laying in bed with my wife. She's laying in bed, and I'm sitting here. And she can't lay in bed and witness this video, and I can't make this video and lay in bed. I can't think these thoughts and think a different thought at the same moment. So we've got the least amount of choice, the most amount of density, the smallest, shortest version of the energy pattern right here. One thing at a time. One thought, one word, one location, one activity at a time. It's finite, it's dense, it's small. We're in an either-or paradigm in the actuality of reality. The probability field is much bigger. When you call up, where's Dad? I don't know. Well, where is he likely to be? We're talking about probable reality. Well, he's probably somewhere, he got in the car, it was an hour ago, so he's somewhere within 100 miles of this address. He probably went and visited Uncle Harry, he went there. There's a probability field. It's, in imagination, he's in multiple places. He could be here, he could be there, he could have stopped for a picnic, he could have had a flat tire. It's a probability field. And the probability field is vastly bigger than the actuality. Because when you find his actual body, it will be in one location, at one time, at one point on the probability field. But the probability field, before you know where that is all over the place. Possible, probable, actual. Well, all human thought is correlated, synthesized, and regulated through language. And all language is an organized pattern of particles. You take the undifferentiated whole, you take the totality of existence, and you cut it up somewhat arbitrarily into little boxes. Now, if it's time, someone says, let's have hours. Why hours? Why not let's have hours and a half? In other words, why not name the hour 90 minutes instead of 60 minutes? Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to call an hour 60 minutes. Okay. And why not have a minute be 10 seconds? No particular reason. We're going to carve up the box somewhat arbitrarily in some relationship to the type of timescape that the observer and measuring device called the human ego relates to. So the body has a lifespan. In most of the history of the planet, that lifespan has been somewhere between 20 years old and 80 years old. Let's just say 80, 90 years old. The last few centuries we've been piling on a few years, but let's just say in the history of humanity across, in the different lifestyles, if you live in Antarctica with a low technology cult, 200,000 years ago, maybe the average lifespan is 20. If you live near a volcano that erupts violently, but that's the only land available, and it erupts every 20 years, killing most of the people, okay, your average lifespan is 20 years to 80 years. Now that's a size. It's a certain number of suns passing the planet. And so if you want to be in scale with human time, you want to have increments that are meaningful for that observing and measuring device. So an hour feels like a good chunk, a minute, a good chunk. Seconds, a little bit. Well, there could be some things useful to measure in seconds. How many seconds do you boil an egg for before it's not cooked just right or too hard boiled? If you want a poached egg, what we want measurements that relate to what we're doing. So someone carves up the endless continuum of time into little boxes that correlate to the scale of the observer, which correlates to the lifespan of the observer. And so we have time carved up into little boxes. And then someone takes the vast, eternal, unending space of all that is, billions upon billions of light years in just our universe, and says, well, we're 6 feet tall or 5 feet tall. So the average human over the course of a life, is 5 feet tall. Well, what's a measurement in scale with that observing and measuring device? Let's have feet. That's 1/6 or 1/5 of the average height. Let's have inches. That's 1/12 of that, or meters. A meter is a good one. There's not so many meters before you get beyond the height of an average human. So let's do that. And then centimeters. Let's break it into 100 units. And of course, for much of human evolution, getting down to the last inch or centimeter was plenty adequate. But if you're doing microchips and you're looking through robotic lenses and if you're trying to build an atomic computer, a supercomputer with subatomic particles and atomic particles, and arrange that, well, now you need millionths of an inch to be relevant for that goal. So we take the unending chunk of space, and before we chop it up, it's just space. Here's some space, there's some space, more space out there. If you leave the planet, there's lots more space out there. There's just lots of space. No one's ever found an end to it. It just goes on. But we want to chop space into bits, so we pick sizes and we break reality down into bits. And then there's all the rest of reality. There's patterns of energy that are white energy. Well, how do you know they're white energy before you label them as white? Well, we just take this chunk of the light spectrum, we chop it here, and we call that white. Pale white, dark white, it's all just white. And over here, there's blue. Now, a computer chip breaks the color spectrum into 256 million colors. That's the limit of the chip. The human eye, an untrained eye, may not be able to tell the difference between the color spectrum that has been broken into 300. So a computer breaks the color spectrum, the light spectrum, into 256 million distinctions. That's cuts that are just arbitrary. It's taking the continuous whole and cutting it into bits. And the more bits you create, the more words you create. If you say, that's a table, that's a table, that's a table, you've got a rather simple way of cutting the world of flat surfaces up. If you say that's a three-legged table, that's a three-legged table 1 foot high, that's a three-legged table 18 inches high, that's a three-legged table made of wood, another one. The more you nuance the object of energy, the energy that is being observed and measured, in other words, can be observed and measured to the millisecond of time, or to the hour of time, or to the 100-year of time. The observable energy pattern can be measured in black and white with no color distinction, or can be measured with 256 million colors, or why not a billion? The observable energy pattern can be measured in infinite continuums of space, time, and color, because you can always take whatever increment that you've got. Let's say it's an inch. That's your lowest measurement. But what's half of an inch? Well, that's a half inch. Well, what's half of that? There's no end to the distinctions that can be brought into the observing and measuring of an energy pattern, except the limits of the observing and measuring device. But even the human eye, which can't see above and below or hear above and below a certain frequency of energy, you can take the observable. Now, the observable, the definition of observable is not all that can be observed. we're egocentric, meaning we're always referencing ourselves. So when we say the observable spectrum of energy, we say, okay, I can't my observing and measuring devices, my eyes, my ears, my electronic gadget can't go above this higher, like I can't measure anything above 6,000 degrees because my thermometer doesn't go that far. The maximum temperature of my thermometer was 6,000 degrees. So all I know it's above that, I just can't measure it. But whatever we can observe and measure, we can always cut in half, and then in half, and then in half, and then in half, to the point where we can't measure it. But does that mean it couldn't be cut in half for an eternity? Just keep cutting in half it by zooming in, cutting it in, zooming in, cutting it in, zooming in, cutting it in. It goes on endlessly. And this is the descent from the ecological whole that is a more real, meaning it's more true to itself to say that reality is an unending landscape of energy that occurs in the time dimension. There's an unending landscape of time. There's an unending landscape of space. There's an unending landscape of sound. There's an unending landscape of touch. Whatever, let's say you bring 21 million pounds per square inch as a touch metric on the touch continuum of pressure. Couldn't you bring 22 million pounds? A billion pounds? So all of these continuums that are observed and measured by the human body are observed and measured through the senses. And we pay attention to the stuff at the scale that affects our goal as human beings, as individuals, of feeling sustainably better and avoiding feeling chronically worse. So the underlying ecology is not chopped up into boxes. The boxes aren't real. Because if you take the color spectrum, for example, you can't separate, let's take the color green. Well, those familiar with veil painting in watercolors know that if you mix yellow and blue, you get green. And if you have more yellow, it's a lighter green, and more blue, it's a darker green. And eventually it becomes blue. But where's the line? And could you get green without any yellow? So there's yellow inherent in the green, and there's blue inherent in the green. Now, what about the human being? I'm an individual. But could you produce an individual without a planet? Like, has anyone in the tiny fragment of time known as human history ever produced an individual without a planet? They just wrote a memo, produce an individual without a planet. You say, okay, well, we'll send two lovers to the moon for a year. They'll have sex every day for several months just to make sure that the female is impregnated. And then they will have their baby in space on the moon, and you can have a human being without a planet. Okay, well, what about the moon? Okay, well then we'll do it at the International Space Station. Okay, what's the International Space Station orbiting around? And if the population base drawn from came from a planet, what you see if you look closely enough is that nothing can exist without the entirety of every other thing existing. That nothing can exist without the entirety of every other thing existing. If you change the gravitational constant for this pinky, the gravitational constant changes all across the known universe. Because the gravitational constant is a formula. And if you change the variables that produce this effect, gravity isn't localized in the sense as a formula. If you change the constant and you lighten gravity so that your pinky lifts off the ground. So you want to lift the pinky off the ground gravitationally, you change the gravitational constant, the pinky goes off the ground. But what else goes off the ground? Your body goes off the ground. But the gravitational constant is not just you. The very moment you start lifting off the ground, everyone on the planet starts lifting off the ground. And the very moment that things on this planet start lifting off the ground due to a gravitational constant being changed, rocks on Mars start lifting off the ground. Because there's a connection between the equation of energy called gravity as a constant, right here in this pinky, in this fingernail, and the entirety of the universe. So suddenly, there's a lot of things connecting everything with everything else. The gravitational constant is connecting a lot of things. The light spectrum, if you can see something here, it means you can see something in that spectrum over there. So now you've got connections. And if something in the past led to something in the present, now you've got a connection throughout the timescape. If you imagine the state of Oklahoma, and you say, well, here are the state lines. This is a separate state. This is Oklahoma. You're not in Kansas, you're not over, well, you're here. If you separate everything around, cut off the rest of the country, Oklahoma doesn't function like Oklahoma. You could take a giant space excavator and scoop out Oklahoma and lift it over into the Pacific Ocean and drop it down. But if Oklahoma sinks, it's no longer the Oklahoma it was before. And all the states that surround Oklahoma are changed by the absence. In other words, you cannot change one piece of the uninterrupted ecology of unindividuated wholeness without changing everything else. One thing affects the whole affects the one. So in reality, we are part of an uninterrupted whole that is occurring on infinite continuums, on multiple dimensions, most of which we are likely ignorant about because we lack the observing and measuring devices, the senses, to observe energy on those other dimensions. So that's reality. And then in order to relate with the vastness of reality that is unconscious, because before language there is no consciousness of consciousness. There's no consciousness of consciousness before language, because all thought is viewed through the lens of language. And all thought is what we call consciousness. When we think a thought and remember, let's put the thought back together. Now we compose the thought out of bits. What are those bits called? Words. We decide to call this a hand. Why? Why not call it 200 billion atoms? Well, it's too complicated. We need some word to describe something we use a lot, so we'll call this a hand. We've got two hands. Well, we'll call this the right hand, and this will be the left hand. So when we, having broken the whole, the entirety of the ecological landscape into bits, and then crudely superimposed the boxes of words on top of those bits so that we know which bits we're talking about, we then reassemble reality through language, and we remember our thought, which was our assembly of language, by saying, what was I just thinking? And then we reassemble the words that formed the thought that we had just assembled before, and now we have language. Now we have remembering. Now we have awareness of awareness. Because the awareness comes from language, and the awareness of awareness comes from watching the language that we just put together. Now we have the distinction of a past observation from a present witness, where we now can look back and say, oh, he was talking about little boxes of words a moment ago. I am distinct in time from him. He was talking about little boxes of words a few minutes ago. Now I'm remembering and observing what he talked about. It's not me. I'm not talking about that right now. I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about remembering. He was talking about boxes and words and something like that. I'm talking about the distinction between me and him. And so we now have consciousness squared through language, where we make a record in writing, and then we relate and interact with the record. This is what he did. What was he thinking 5 minutes ago? That's not right. I'm now responding to him. So it's getting denser. And then I'm responding to that. You mean he thought it was a good idea to respond to him? That's not me. I'm focusing over here. And now I'm focusing on him focusing over there while he was looking back at what he said over there. So we're overlaying through memory and through spatial identity, because we create partition through the analogy, through the metaphor of space. Are there really all these different speakers and thinkers happening at the same time, but I'm only at one point in the track? Is it like a CD player that has 750,000 distinct images in a typical feature movie, and just moves from one image to the other to the other. And I'm where the laser is right now, seeing one image at 1 microsecond. But all the other 750,000 images in the movie, they're all there. The laser just isn't shining on them. Now, why 750,000? Why not 2 million images? Well, at some point, since it takes energy to create every one of those images and compress them into a CD or a DVD or a Blu-ray or whatever the new format is, it's meaningless because it took extra energy to go from 750,000 images to 2 million images, but the eye could barely notice the difference of going from 300,000 to 700,000. So you're working for a low return on investment that isn't appreciated by the viewer, so that's good enough. We'll just call it there. We don't need to deal with microseconds. Most of the time, we don't need to deal with seconds. Come here in a few minutes. That's close enough to the vagueness of the ineffable landscape that is time. Because the reality of time is ineffable. The reality of space is ineffable. The reality of sound is ineffable. What does ineffable mean? It means before it was chopped up into little boxes so that the human ego could say, I, as one of those boxes, am in relationship with that, which is another little box, and could engage in that relationship. Now, that relationship is an illusion. It's an illusion because the boxes are arbitrary and they are self-generated. Meaning, as soon as you think a thought that that's good, and you decide that's good, then that's good because you decided it was good. And other than relativity to something known, we can't say that. Like every human being in the history of humanity has wanted to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse. Now, where does sadomasochism and that kind of stuff fit in? Well, if in the archetypal shaping of the growth pattern to meet one's human needs, a whole bunch of little boxes that we've organized to work with, and you're happy and you ask mom for a lollipop or some attention, and she tells you to go fuck yourself, and then you start crying, and then suddenly, what happened? Suddenly she volunteers the attention that you wanted and asked for and was rejected. She volunteers it because why? It seems to happen when I'm in pain. That part of the psyche now seeks out pain in order to get attention. And so, yes, we do have deeply ingrained templates in all kinds of abused people, because that's called an abused child. A parent that only gives affection or any regard when the child is in severe pain and ignores them and is hostile just if they're enjoying themselves. A parent that teaches a child that if you're happy, you will not survive because I will not care for you. But if you're in pain, you will survive and you'll have my attention. That pattern teaches that I will not survive without pain, therefore I must seek pain and be fearful of its loss, because then I won't survive. And so yes, within the contortions of dysfunctional family. There are all kinds of people in all kinds of ways that actively seek out pain in a variety of ways. Whatever that thing was that had to be done to get attention. For example, some men feel insecure and hostile to women unless the women are clumsy. The men feel threatened by competence, but if the woman is clumsy and acknowledges her incompetence, trips over herself constantly and apologizes constantly. Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so clumsy. Where's my keys? Could you? Well, this will bring out the chivalrous romantic trait in a male that is fearful of competency. What they're really fearful of is criticism. Because if someone is too competent and you try and be chivalrous, you will get in their way because they've got it covered much better than you have as a relative stranger because they know themselves, their routine. So if a highly competent person encounters a chivalrous stranger, the net result is the chivalrous stranger has to conclude, I was useless. I just got in her way, and she has every right to be annoyed and dispense with me. I'm not needed. I feel small, unnecessary, and unlovable. I don't like feeling that way, so I resent the women who make me feel that way with their competence. Therefore, I'm going to associate with and reward with smiles and graciousness, etc., bumbling idiots who make it absolutely clear that their life would fall apart. Oh, what would I do without you? I needed that appointment and I just dropped my keys 3 feet from my car. What would I have done? Oh, thank you, sir. Well, when this is met with mating interest and all of that, and competence is met with hostility and competition and judgment, well, there may be a part that is committed to incompetency as a way to elevate human well-being. Makes sense. So, where does joy come into all of this? Joy is the marker on the thermometer of the human heart and body that illuminates that we're getting near the ineffable. What is the ineffable? It is the whole before it is chopped into language. It is the whole before it is chopped into bits. And the bits, crude as they are, artificially imposed as they are, create pain. What is pain? It's separation from and it's longing for. Separation from and longing for wholeness. Healing is the greatest joy. What is healing? It is deleting the boxes that create the illusion of separation and isolation and loneliness and dissociation through identification with a pattern that is named as a box, an identity, distinct from other patterns named as other boxes. And now I'm all alone because I'm this box and no one's like me. I'm here and you're there. I think this and you think that. I feel this and you feel that. I have this memory and you have that memory. I have this hierarchy of values and you have that hierarchy of values. There's so many boxes that stand between us and the experience of oneness that gives birth to it all. You know, you can't have the number 10 if you don't have the number 1. What is 10? It's 10 times 1. If you delete the 1, you don't have the other. You don't get Nebraska the way Nebraska is without Arkansas the way it is. You don't get the Americas the way they are without the Asian continent counterbalancing the Earth in its gravitational spin. If the temperature rises at the equator, it also rises at the North and South Pole. Everything affects everything else. It is all interconnected. You don't get one without the other. But the illusion of language, the illusion of the partitions, creates vast lists of distinctions within the human mind that separate us from everything else. And joy, as we rise in the density equation, as we rise in the frequency equation, as we rise in the consciousness vibrational continuum and reach up to the edge of language, we feel joy. We remember a place and a one before we were cast out of the garden. What is the garden? The garden is the vast, interconnected whole, the vast ecology, the system of energy that is one. One time, one space, one energy, without the cuts in the ecology that create the wound of the human identity. Because in order to say that I am this and not that, I have to cut a line between this and that, and define this and define that. And when I cut that line and define that line and say that is that and this is this, now I can be separate. Now I can live in the illusion that this could exist without that, which is scientifically irrational. So the scientific truth is the ecological truth, but the scientific paradigm of insisting that something must be measured and observed precludes the scientific truth that all things are connected, meaning there is absolutely nothing that can be measured and observed that can be completely isolated from everything else. Now, if you follow that series in a line, this has something to do with that, that has something to do with that, that has something to do with that. If you will go on the spiral journey of interconnectivity, all things directly or indirectly relate to all things. All times directly relate to all times. All space relates to all space. All color relates to all color. All sound relates to all sound. All people relate to all people. All planets relate to all planets. All technology relates to all technology. All culture relates to all culture. There is no absolute distinction. But we live in the wound of the cuts that we have built layer by layer by cutting the timescape, the landscape, the spacescape, the colorscape into billions upon billions of wounds. Wounds create pain. If I say this is an integrated energy body, it is a whole. My heart sends blood to here, my here sends veins back to the heart, my skin connects to this skin over here, this finger is connected to this hand is connected to this thing. Now if I breach that ecology and cut the hand, now I can't move my fingers because I've cut the veins that move the fingers. I've cut the nerves that gave me the feedback. Now there's pain. And joy is the cessation of pain. Meaning the greatest joy is the joy of healing. And the greatest healing is ascending out of the knowledge of good and evil. Good, evil. You take the circle, the one, the totality of the feminine state, you cut it in two, a masculine expression. You divided the orange in half, and you now say good half and bad half. Why? So that it can be distinct, so there's contrast, and so there's language. Because one means nothing if it's the only number. We means nothing if we're the only we. If we say we are one, that only means something if there are other things other than one. If there's 2, 3, 5, 600 billion, and we are one, then it means something because it's different than 600 billion. We're one instead of 2, instead of 3, instead of 600 billion. So then it means something in context with its distinction of what? Its difference. That's not transcending duality. To transcend duality, there is no language. Because there is no thought. Because there is no distinction. We are one before the word one existed. We are in the garden before the knowledge of good and evil, before time was broken into boxes, before space was broken into lines and angles, before numbers were compartmentalized, before values were made good and bad. Before all of that, we were one. And the whole functioned exactly as it does now, but without the illusion of separation. Whatever is going on, whatever that isness is, still was, still is, still will be. But before language, there was no identification with one piece in tension with another piece, because this is the ultimate pain and the ultimate fear. All fear is fear of pain. All pain begins with separation. All separation begins with thought. All thought begins with language. All language begins with the wound, with the cut. That's a chair, that's a table. And the line between them is the wound. The line between them disacknowledges the relationship between the two. It says this is a separate piece of energy that has nothing to do with this. You are your own person. No, you're not. You don't exist without your parents, without their parents, without their parents, without the planet that gave birth to them, without the oxygen from the trees, without the water that keeps you alive every 3 days at least, without the millions of people collaborating in an experiment called a global economy. You don't exist without all of that. And if gravity decides to change tomorrow, and you float off into space and have no oxygen, you don't exist then either. But what doesn't exist? Physicists say there's no creation or destruction of energy. So what doesn't exist when you don't exist? No energy is created or destroyed. It turns from one thing to another. In other words, if you float off into space and give all in the vacuum of space, all the water is sucked into droplets that forms ice, and that ice mixes with other ice to form comets, and that comet eventually crashes into a landmass, and that landmass gives birth to new life because a water molecule from your body connected with organic matter in some form that alchemized to create a synergy, a new pattern that didn't exist before that occurred. Has life ended or has it changed? If you lay your body in a 3-foot hole and a tree sucks the nitrogen out of your blood and it blooms and bears fruit more profusely than before, producing more and bigger fruit than before that feeds animals more robustly than before, that leads to more pregnancies of chimpanzees than before. Has life ended, or have you taken the form of a chimpanzee? And before language that said this is good and this is bad, could you say that I don't want to die, and I am better than a chimpanzee who is not destroying its planet? Me, I'm destroying my planet, but I'm better than a chimpanzee who is not destroying their planet because I have a brain. I'm thinking about how to destroy my planet with 100 tons of garbage and 1,500 tons of CO2, and I'm consciously doing all that, whereas the chimpanzee is just unconsciously perpetuating its ecology by shitting on the ground and giving rise to trees rather than sending shit out into the ocean to cause algae blooms to kill fish, amongst many other ways of. So the pain that we fear, because all fear is something happened in the past that separated us, that left us feeling alone. The ultimate fear is the fear of loneliness, that I'm totally and completely alone. There's no one like me. I don't matter, and I'm separate from all that is. That's the fear that is created through the wound of language and thought. And the greatest joy is the joy of healing that pain. Because the language, the distinction, the separation is the pain. Pain is the separation from something and the longing for something. What separates us from and leads us to long for is words and distinction, is paradigms. If you subscribe to a materialist and they say that nothing has any meaning, but you long for meaning, but you believe that you have no meaning, you are separate from meaning but long for it. All humans long for meaning. Purpose is an expression of meaning. All humans long for meaning, to matter. And they do. The equation that gives rise to the possibility field that is all around us could not exist without you. The equation of the probability field, which is possibility squared, if the possibility field cannot exist without you, the probability field can't either. And if the actual field, which is the possibility field squared, then the probability field squared too, if that couldn't exist without you either. Why? Well, the possibility field is a formula that creates all possibility. And the very fact that you exist meant that you were possible before you became probable, and you were probable before you became actual. So if you destroy the equation that creates the entirety of reality so that the possibility field collapses and just stops being, then the probability field collapses at the same moment and the actuality field collapses at the same moment. Now, how can you have a program, a mathematical formula that creates everything, but then say, wait, just one moment, thank you for everything. This one little piece, few billion atoms, let's just take them out. And now everything can continue exactly the way it was before in the possibility field. That's fine. It's just this one thing. Well, you have a hole in the fabric. You have a wound in the formula. Now, if you protect the wound, like there's this one little bit of the stitching where we're going to delete this bit of the stitching. But now the other stitching around it starts to unravel. So if you delete one thing from the possibility field, you change the entirety of everything. Could it exist? Well, how can you have a possibility field if everything that's possible is not in it and you're possible? How could you have a possibility field with anything missing? Anything. Your uncle's brass ring that's rusting in the garden. If that wasn't possible, how could the possibility field exist? It couldn't. How could the possibility field exist without you? It can't. I'm meaningless? I have no meaning? But the entirety of the mathematical formula of all existence can't exist without me? That the energy that is currently in this pattern, which will over billions of years be recycled into one pattern after another, that if that energy was missing, the entire possibility field would no longer exist. By definition of the fact that you are obviously a possibility, because you're possibility squared and probability squared, which means you're a very possible thing. And your energy is not going anywhere for the history of time. It will just become soil, and then maybe water, and then maybe gaseous air, and then maybe erupt out of a volcano, and then become mango, and then be consumed by apes, and become monkeys, and then become humans, and then it's just going to go on for billions of years, and it can't happen without you. Can't happen. So the idea, the cut, the organization of language that says you are meaningless is not scientific. Though many scientists have faith in their own meaningless thoughts. Meaning, having said that nothing means anything, they eagerly want you to buy their book because it apparently means something to them that you get, that you don't matter. Why? If it's so meaningless, why did they write the book in the first place? Everyone wants to have meaning. And the main reason certain people write books about how meaningless they are is because that gets them more attention than if they don't write the book. And why does getting attention matter if they mean nothing to themselves or anyone else? If their ideas mean nothing, their books mean nothing, their life means nothing, why do they need to make money if their life is so meaningless? Well, if we reward people for being controversial, for saying shocking things, then certain human beings have to waste a lot of time creating shocking things to write about so that they can mean something and be important by shocking people who will pay money to be shocked. Well, joy is lifting above the language. It's returning to the garden. Joy is the remembrance before there was memory. It's the pre-structural. It's the complete surrender to the cycle of all that is. It's all just going to keep growing and changing and doing this and then doing that and then doing this other thing. If we blow up this planet with nuclear weapons tomorrow, the pieces will not go anywhere. The pieces of nuclear material will keep changing and growing. The pieces from the planet that shoot out into space, they will keep growing and changing. Every single piece of energy that ever has been, that is, and will be, just takes different forms, from one form to another. But it takes the human mind to cut the possibility field into good and bad, black and white, growth and evil, whatever. And then take a position on the good side against what? The bad side. That takes work. That takes suffering. But we can't rape children. That's bad. Well, then it's bad that parents raised people to rape children. Yeah, that's bad too. Well, then it's bad that the culture does not teach parenting at school. Yeah. The education system, it's fucked up. Well, then the people who designed the education system are not very intelligent. I know, they're terrible. What were they thinking? Algebra instead of organic cooking. How to make people homeless and make more money rather than do this. What were they thinking? No classes on good relationships? How to make your partner ecstatic with sex 3 times a day? Why wasn't that in high school? What fools? Well, see, they were born from other people who raised them to be fools. I know. The whole country is fucked up. And the country migrated from other places, from other people. I know they're terrible people. I mean, who needs them? And the planet gave birth to this species. What was it thinking? Does it have a death wish? I mean, why set up the algorithm so that the people who are most efficient at extracting energy, that life form takes over the whole planet and there's no penalties? Why didn't Mother Nature do it this way so that people would behave? Mother Nature, what were you thinking? Well, see, Mother Nature emerged out of the planet. It's doomed. Well, see, the planet emerged out of the solar system. What was it thinking? You got your math wrong, solar system. You went to all that trouble to create human life and 200 million separate species in 5 billion years, and you got a few equations right, and it's all gonna, and now children are being molested. Solar system, get your act together. Have more planets with nicer people. Well, see, the solar system didn't just come out of nowhere. I know the universe. What was it thinking? This solar system, that solar system, random choice. What a dumb system. Random choice. This planet will survive and this one won't, and what a crazy idea. Is God rolling dice? It's terrible. It's terrible. God, get it together. Well, if wherever you stop, the whole thing is completely fucked up. All of it. But I'm somehow different because I come out of this universe that's fucked up, and the fucked up God that made everything else made me too, and the fucked up education things were raised by the same people who raised me. My fucked up thinking system came out of the fucked up thing. So in other words, if the foundation of everything is this is bad, it's wrong, and it's fucked up, you can follow it out. It's all fucked up. If this is good, wherever it is, you follow it out, it's all good, because it's all interconnected. No, it's not. It's the good ones against the bad ones, and the good ones have to win. If you cut the earth in half and do battle, and let's say you destroy the other half, you spin out of orbit, so you've destroyed the other half as well. My right hand is the good hand, my left hand is the bottom. Cut it down the middle and discard the left hand, and a few minutes later, the right hand has lost all the blood, it's bled out. These wounds, these separations, they're inevitable in human consciousness, as is suffering. Suffering is the experience of living in an observing and measuring pattern that cuts everything into bits, isolates them, and ranks them in a way that makes most of life seem horrible through the lens of language. And joy is the ineffable memory before that happened. Joy is the wonder that doesn't quite fit into words. It is the experience of one's authentic preferences being met. It is a low friction vibration. So you can take light just going through an electrical wire. It's just very fast. You connect it and just the electron just fly through that copper wire. You don't see anything. It's a light, low resistance experience. You don't see anything. If you touch the wire, you don't feel anything. If you touch both of them, you may get an electric shock, but it's just going through because you're blocking it. The shock comes from short-circuiting the flow. But the electricity that's not being blocked, that's going somewhere, it's invisible. And joy is just below invisibility. So how do you get to see? How does a human become conscious of joy? Well, it has to slow the energy down enough so that it can be observable and measurable through human consciousness and human language. Because having divided the world into language and looked at it through the lens of language, if it doesn't have language, it doesn't exist. So if it doesn't exist, we're not joyful because we're nothing. It doesn't register. The universe could be filled with joy, but if we don't have a word for it, can't measure it in any way because it doesn't show up in our little box, our prism, our prison of belief and language, of measurements and random combinations that fit patterns that meet our paradigms and our beliefs. Well, joy has to make an appearance. So it makes it in a very high range up there. So if you put a little tiny filament between one of those electrical wires and interrupt it, cover it in glass in a vacuum, you get light. You get interruption or you don't see it. It's energy that has been slowed down. See, now the energy has to go through that tiny little spiral. And as it goes through that tiny little spiral, having to travel that whole thing before it can carry on the wire, it slows down to a level where we can see it with the low frequency observing and measuring device of the human eye. And once we can see it, we say, that's joy. It's up there. It's beautiful. It's bright. That's joy. If you take it down and down and down, it becomes heat. Take it down and down and down, it becomes fire. You can take the energy spectrum, and the darkest human states are pain, fear, hate, hopelessness. They're incredibly dense. It's the equivalent of shorting the whole system out, and it's just smoking. The smoke, I smell it. It's real. It's fires and smokes and burnt things. It's really dense energy. You just fold it and fold it and fold it. And so it's, if you fold a single sheet 1,000,000 times and compress it together, it'll become as hard as a rock. It's dense because you keep folding it. And that's what hate is. That's what terror is. That's what, it's very, very fold. It's the same energy. Just fold it down, 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 until it's really solid. Now I've got something solid. Why do teenagers love sulking and bitterness so much? Because nobody can knock them off it. Teenagers are fed up with being batted around in their human states by the giants around them. One minute the parent says, oh, I'll do this for you. The teenager gets all excited, right? And the next parent, oh, I forgot. I'm sorry. Now the teenager's crashed. But maybe tomorrow I'll do this other thing. Maybe? I don't want to be battered around, you dinged up moron. I want some solidity. I want some autonomy. I want something that people can't just bat around. I want some resentment. How do you build resentment? Well, you take this thought and you fold it on that thought, and then you fold it on that thought, and you fold it 10,000 times. You remember that thought 10,000. And then someone says, we'll buy you a lollipop on Monday. You can't take my resentment. It's solid. I don't care. I don't care about anything. I've got something solid. Finally, the fucked up morons out there can't take away from me, and I'm holding on to it. It may feel cruddy, maybe one of the worst human states imaginable, filled with bitterness, resentment, and cynicism, but it's mine, and you can't budge it. You can promise me all your bullshit like you did before, but I'm just holding on to it. I'm not going to remember all those things you did before, because I'm holding on to it. It's dense, it's solid. That's the low end of continuum. Up at the very top is joy, where you slow it down just enough to notice it, and it's gone. Like that. It's where was it? It's just gone. What can you say about it? Wow. It's gone. It's gone. What can I say? It's joy. Joy. It was joyful. It's gone. It's a low friction vibration. Words break it down endlessly, but you have high friction. The more words you stick in, it's this, it's that, it's, that's why you can write an entire book about the outrage of the pizza man taking a tip. Just call it entitlement. The cult we live in. Oh, well, the pizza man did this, this, and that. The entire thing just, you can go on and on and on. You can develop a world out of the outrage of entitlement. Try writing a paragraph about sheer joy. The very thing that makes it sheer joy is the fact that it has not been cut up into wounds called language. It's ineffable. Wow, I don't even know how to describe it. Just one. Sometimes you get a moment like that. Like what? It's just a moment. I can't put it into words. It's joy. It's the highest vibration. You could call it, joy is about healing. It's fun. Joy is fun. Can you be conscious of all the fun? Well, some of it you can be conscious of, but then you have to put it into words and it stops being so fun. If you have to think about it and put it into words, it's not fun anymore, but it's just fun. It's fun to be joyful. And so we've talked for an hour and 20 minutes about what joy isn't, because those are low vibrations. And you can talk about them for days. We've talked less than 5 minutes. We've talked less than 1 minute about joy, because it's ineffable. It's above the cuts that we use to create our human suffering. And that's what's so amazing about it. It's incredible. Joy.